I never thought I'd reach the point where I'd just walk away. Not in anger, not in a dramatic, yelling at each other kind of way. I thought I was the type of person who would always try to fix things, who would fight for someone, even when it hurt. But that night, something in me snapped. And honestly, I think I finally realized that some fights aren't meant to be won. They're meant to show you the truth about yourself. It started like any other Friday evening. She'd had a rough day at work. Typical project deadline chaos. Emails stacking like mini skyscrapers. And I've been trying to be supportive, asking the usual, "How was your day?" kind of questions. But she wasn't in the mood for small talk. Not that she usually was when she got home, but this time it felt sharper, more cutting. Her words didn't just sting. They sliced through me in a way I hadn't expected. "You should be grateful I even chose you," she said. She was standing by the kitchen counter, holding her wine glass like a weapon, eyes locked on mine, and that tone, it made me freeze. Grateful? Grateful that she deigned to like me enough to date me? I remember thinking, am I in a weird dream? Is this real life? I opened my mouth, ready to defend myself, to argue, to tell her that relationships aren't supposed to be competitions, that love isn't about a hierarchy of who's lucky enough to get chosen. But the words didn't come out as an argument. They came out as quiet, sharp honesty. "You're right," I said. There was a pause. Not the long, heavy pause of dramatic tension you see in movies, but a brief, almost imperceptible flicker of surprise on her face. And for a second, I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time. Clarity. It wasn't anger that made me speak the truth. It wasn't even sadness, not yet. It was recognition. Recognition that I had been pretending I was okay with this imbalance. Pretending that her occasional flashes of narcissistic superiority were quirky or strong personality traits. But they weren't. They were manipulative, exhausting, and soul-draining. And I was done pretending. I walked to my bedroom, grabbed my backpack, and started packing. Not like some dramatic exit where you slam doors and throw clothes everywhere. Just quietly, deliberately, item by item, taking things I genuinely cared about. My headphones, my notebooks, the hoodie she hated because it was too messy, and stacking them in the bag. I kept my movements calm because I didn't want to give her the satisfaction of seeing me flinch or cry or beg. I just moved with intention. She watched me, sitting on the couch, phone in hand. I could see the calculation in her eyes, the silent question. Is this a test? Will he cave? But I didn't. Not this time. I kept packing, calmly, deliberately, like every item in that bag was a piece of me reclaiming space I had allowed her to occupy for too long. By the time I zipped the bag and slung it over my shoulder, I felt lighter than I had in months. Maybe even years. I left a note on the bedside table. Short, blunt, real. I'm done. This isn't love if it hurts more than it heals. I didn't wait for a reply. I didn't look back. When she came home later that night, she found my side of the closet empty. No dramatic confrontation, no pleading messages on the table. Just emptiness. And for the first time, I think she realized something. Something I wish I could have screamed at her face. She wasn't the prize. She never was. She wasn't the one choosing me. She was the reason I left. The next week, my phone buzzed constantly with paragraphs of texts, each one longer, more desperate than the last. She tried every tactic, apologies, guilt trips, explanations, confessions, but I never opened a single one. I had already made my choice. And honestly, that's the part that surprised me the most. The freedom wasn't in leaving her. The freedom was in finally realizing that I didn't owe anyone my self-respect, not even someone I once loved. For the first time in a long time, I felt like myself again. The first few days after I left were strange. I expected a rush of relief, maybe even happiness, but it wasn't like that. It was quiet. Too quiet. My apartment felt empty. Not in a comforting, peaceful way, but in a hollow, echoing way, like every sound bounced off walls that hadn't realized they'd lost someone important. And the silence wasn't just in the apartment. It was in my mind, too. At first, I tried to distract myself. I went for long walks around the city, the kind where you don't even notice the time passing. I wandered through streets I had walked 100 times before, but this time, everything seemed different, like the world had shifted slightly, and I was seeing it from a new angle. The cafes smelled sharper, the streetlights seemed colder, and the people walking past me looked like they were in a rush to escape their own thoughts, just like me. I checked my phone occasionally. Not for her messages, I didn't open any of them, but just to remind myself that the world still moved on without waiting for my approval. And every time I saw her name flash across the screen, a tiny part of me wanted to open the text, to read what she was saying, to feel that familiar twinge of guilt or excitement or whatever it was. But I didn't. I couldn't. Not after what had happened. I started noticing things I hadn't paid attention to before. The way my neighbors greeted me in the morning, the sound of the train rattling down the tracks near my apartment, the smell of coffee brewing in the cafe across the street. All of it felt alive, real, not filtered through the lens of constant tension and subtle emotional manipulation. And slowly, I began to feel a sense of possibility. Possibility that I could exist without someone constantly reminding me of my shortcomings. Possibility that I could make choices for myself without fear of judgment or criticism. Possibility that I could finally really breathe. But the possibility was accompanied by loneliness. Not the easy, lonely that comes from being alone by choice, but the gnawing, heavy loneliness that makes your chest ache when you realize that someone who was once a part of your life is now completely out of reach. The text kept coming paragraphs at a time. I could see the typing indicators, the scene marks, and every message was a small explosion in my chest. But I stayed strong. I had to. One night, I found myself scrolling through old photos. Not of us together. God, I couldn't do that. But the moments I had ignored while I was caught up in her world. The quiet mornings I spent reading by the window, the nights I had gone for runs to clear my mind, the tiny joys that had been swallowed by constant conflict. And I realized something important. I had let someone else define my happiness for far too long. I had given away pieces of myself, thinking it was love when it was actually survival. I began reconnecting with old friends, people I hadn't spoken to in months because I was too busy navigating someone else's drama. They welcomed me back like nothing had changed, like I had never been lost in a relationship that drained me. We laughed, we drank, we stayed up talking about everything and nothing, and for the first time in years, I felt normal. Not judged, not inadequate, not like I was constantly failing. Just myself. But reality has a funny way of sneaking in, even when you're trying to move forward. A mutual friend mentioned seeing her downtown, looking frantic, scrolling through her phone like she was searching for something or someone. Part of me felt a flicker of satisfaction, not revenge, not triumph, just recognition that my absence had caused a ripple, that my leaving had an effect. And yet, there was also a pang of guilt. Was I wrong for walking away? Had I abandoned something that could have been fixed? I spent hours wrestling with that question. I replayed the argument in my head, word by word, gesture by gesture. Her eyes, the tone of her voice, the smug satisfaction in her words, all of it. And slowly, I began to understand that leaving wasn't an act of cruelty. It wasn't giving up. It was survival. It was reclaiming my right to be treated with respect, to be seen as more than a choice someone else made. Then came the emails. Not texts, emails, long, carefully written, polished, desperate. Each one a story, an attempt to justify, to explain, to manipulate. And I realized, maybe for the first time, how clear the difference was between love and obsession. She loved the idea of having me, of controlling me, of proving that I couldn't exist without her. But I had begun to love myself. And that was terrifying, because self-love doesn't negotiate. Self-love doesn't compromise when it comes to respect. Self-love doesn't accept being treated like a prize in someone else's game. I deleted the emails. Not just the ones she sent, but the urge to respond, the urge to explain, the urge to justify myself. They were ghosts now, memories that belonged to someone else's version of reality. I was building my own, slowly, day by day, piece by piece. And I started dreaming again. Not about her, not about the fights or the apologies or the texts, but about life beyond the shadow of someone else's expectations. I imagined new places, new routines, new friends. I imagined the small, quiet victories that come from reclaiming your time, your energy, your mind. By the end of that second week, I had started to feel something I hadn't felt in years. Hope. Real, stubborn, persistent hope. And with it came a strange, almost frightening thought. Maybe I didn't need anyone else to define my worth. Maybe I could be enough on my own. That night, I slept without the familiar knot of anxiety in my chest. I didn't dream of arguments or texts or her voice. I dreamed of walking through a city I'd never seen, windows glowing with life, people moving past me but not touching me, and a sky so vast I could breathe without restriction. It was the first night I felt free. Truly free. By the third week, the novelty of freedom started to fade. Not in a bad way, but in a way that forced me to confront something I hadn't considered while I was still inside that relationship. The world keeps moving, even when your personal storm has passed. And the ripples of leaving someone like her, they don't stop at your apartment door. It started small. Mutual friends started sending awkward messages, indirect questions about how I was holding up, thinly veiled attempts to drag me into arguments I didn't want to have. Some of them sided with her, subtly, gently, as if I was overreacting, as if she wasn't capable of saying the kind of things she said. Others understood, but even they didn't fully get it. Because you can't fully understand someone else's manipulation unless you've lived through it. And I had. Then came the calls. Long, meandering, sometimes polite, sometimes venomous, always designed to make me doubt myself. She didn't just text anymore. She called, left voicemails, sometimes multiple in a row. At first, I answered once just to hear her voice, just to check if maybe, somehow, she had changed. But no, it was the same. Sharp words wrapped in fake sweetness. Apologies that felt like accusations. Confessions that twisted blame back onto me. One evening, I found myself pacing the living room after listening to 3 separate voicemails in a row. My hand shook, not because I was afraid, but because it was exhausting to hear someone try to rewrite history, to make you feel guilty for existing outside their control. I wanted to reply. I wanted to tell her to stop, to leave me alone. But I didn't. I had made a promise to myself. Silence is sometimes louder than words. Work became my anchor. I threw myself into it. Not to escape, but to rebuild. Meetings, deadlines, late-night projects. They all gave me structure, something predictable in a world that had felt chaotic for so long. And slowly, I began to notice something remarkable. I could function without her voice in the background. I could laugh at jokes without thinking about her rolling her eyes. I could plan the weekend without second-guessing if she would approve. The simple things I had taken for granted before, the little freedoms I'd ignored, suddenly felt enormous. But then came the unexpected. I ran into her at a cafe downtown. She wasn't expecting me, at least that's what I thought. But the look on her face told a different story. Surprise, yes, but also calculation. She smiled, the kind of smile that used to make me doubt my own instincts, the kind that made me feel like I had somehow failed even when I hadn't. "Hey," she said, casual, calm, like nothing had happened. I froze for a second, unsure whether to acknowledge her at all. But I did. I nodded. We sat at opposite ends of the cafe, pretending to be casual. She talked. I listened, mostly because I wanted to see where this was going. Every sentence was measured, every word chosen to test, to probe, to see if I'd flinch. And for a moment, I almost did. Old feelings, old habits, old fears, they surfaced like ghosts I hadn't exorcised. But then I remembered her words during that argument, the ones that had finally broken the spell. "You should be grateful I even chose you." And I realized, sitting there, that she hadn't changed. She had only refined her methods. And that was liberating in a strange way. I left before the conversation could go any further. No dramatic exit, no parting words, no confrontation. Just walked out, bag over my shoulder, coffee untouched. And walking down the street, I felt that strange, exhilarating mix of fear and freedom. Because every step I took away from her, I reclaimed a piece of myself I hadn't realized was lost. The ripple effect didn't stop there. Social media became a minefield. Mutual friends shared posts that seemed designed to provoke, to make me feel small. Photos of her smiling, tagged with friends, with captions that were vague but pointed. I could have reacted. I could have argued. I could have tried to defend myself in the public eye. But I didn't. Silence, once again, became my strongest shield. Instead, I focused on small victories. I started running again, longer distances than before. I joined a weekend writing class, something I had always wanted to do, but never had the energy for. I cooked meals I actually liked, not the ones she preferred. I slept in my apartment without tension, without the constant worry that I was failing someone else's impossible standards. And with each small victory, I felt a sense of ownership over my life I hadn't felt in years. But there were nights, inevitable nights, when I'd lie in bed, staring at the ceiling, feeling the weight of loneliness creep in. Not the loneliness of missing her, but the loneliness of realizing that freedom often comes at a price. That price is emptiness at first, a vacuum where someone else used to occupy your energy, your attention, your mind. And in that emptiness, you have to confront yourself. Every fear, every insecurity, every question you push aside while you're distracted by someone else's drama. One night, I found myself writing again. Not emails, not messages to her, just writing for me. Pages and pages, letting thoughts pour out. Anger, relief, fear, hope, all of it. And in those pages, I began to see a pattern, a map of how I had gotten here and where I wanted to go next. She was still out there, still sending messages, still trying, in her own way, to control me. But I had started to see clearly. Her presence was no longer a force that dictated my actions. She was just there, a shadow I had walked out of. And for the first time, I realized that shadows have no power unless you give it to them. By the end of the third week, I had made a silent promise to myself. No matter what she tried, no matter how clever, how desperate, how manipulative, I wouldn't let her pull me back. I would live my life on my terms. And slowly, step by step, I was learning what that meant. Freedom, I realized, isn't loud or dramatic. It isn't about confrontations or vindication. It's quiet, persistent, and sometimes terrifying. But it's also exhilarating. Because for the first time in years, I wasn't running someone else's race. I was running my own. And the world, with all its chaos and noise, felt like a place I could finally exist in. Not just survive IN.by the time the fourth week rolled around. I had settled into a rhythm that felt almost normal. If normal could be defined as living without someone constantly controlling your mood or questioning your every move. I had routines, work, writing, running, cooking meals I actually liked, seeing friends who reminded me what it felt like to be seen and valued. It was comfortable in a way I hadn't felt in years, but comfort has a way of lulling you into vulnerability. That's when she struck again. Not with texts, not with emails, not with calls. This time it was subtler. A chance encounter, or so it seemed. I was at the bookstore, browsing through fiction I hadn't dared touch in months. A light drizzle outside had left people scattered, and the quiet hum of soft jazz in the background made it feel like a safe little bubble. And then I heard her voice. "Hey," she said, calm, measured, but with that familiar undercurrent of something I couldn't quite name. Manipulation? Expectation? Something that had always made my stomach tighten in an unpleasant way. I turned, and there she was, casually leaning against the shelf like she had just wandered in without purpose. But I knew better. She never wandered anywhere without a reason, and she never used words without intention. I said careful, short, controlled. We started talking. Not like old friends, not like former lovers, but like two people circling each other in a dangerous dance. She asked questions about work, about friends, about life in general, but each question was layered, like she was testing my reactions, checking if she could still get under my skin. And for the first time since I left, I felt something familiar, doubt. Not about leaving her, not about her claims or words, but doubt about myself, about my ability to maintain boundaries, about whether my sense of freedom was as solid as I thought. But then I remembered the nights I had spent alone, writing, thinking, running, laughing with friends, sleeping without dread. I remembered the sense of ownership I had slowly reclaimed over my life. And I realized She could test me all she wanted, but she couldn't undo that. The encounter ended without drama. She left with a casual wave, but the ripple stayed. That night, I found myself staring at the ceiling again, running through our past arguments, dissecting each word, each tone, each look. I asked myself if I had truly healed, or if I was just building a fragile bubble around myself to keep her out. And then, like a punch to the gut, the reality hit me. Healing isn't linear. It isn't a straight path from hurt to happiness. It's messy, unpredictable, and filled with moments that make you question your own strength. And the truth is, sometimes those moments come from the people who once hurt you most. The following days were a test. Social media became another battlefield. Friends posted pictures, subtle jabs, hints about moving on or being happy for those who left toxic relationships behind. Every post felt like a comment on my life, whether intended or not. I tried to ignore it, focusing instead on writing and running, but the temptation to respond, to justify, to clarify, to assert myself was real, stronger than I expected. Then came the indirect messages. Friends acting as messengers, sharing fragments of her life, updates that were calculated, knowing I would see them eventually. She was dating someone new, or at least that's what the hint suggested, but the way it was presented felt like a taunt, a reminder that she was moving on, thriving, and I was still processing. But I caught myself. I realized I didn't need to react. She could project her chaos, her victories, her manipulations, but I didn't have to participate. For the first time, I felt truly in control of my own narrative. One evening, I was writing in a small notebook, spilling thoughts onto the page, when it hit me. I had spent so long in that relationship trying to survive someone else's expectations that I had almost forgotten what it felt like to exist for myself. And now, for the first time, I could plan, hope, and dream entirely on my own terms. I started making plans, not dramatic, life-altering plans, but small, deliberate steps toward independence. I signed up for a weekend photography class. I began learning to cook meals I actually enjoyed, experimenting with flavors she would never have tolerated. I started volunteering at a local shelter, connecting with people who had nothing to do with my past or my mistakes. Each action, small as it was, became a building block in reconstructing my identity. But even as I grew stronger, she kept trying. A mutual friend mentioned she had been asking about me, sending messages through people, making vague statements designed to pull me back into her orbit. And I realized something profound. The more she tried to control me, the more clear it became that I wasn't hers to control anymore. I wasn't her choice, her prize, or her possession. I was mine. Yet, freedom came with a cost. Nights alone were often filled with memories, arguments replaying, her voice echoing, moments of affection twisted by anger or resentment. I would lie awake, thinking about how easy it had been to be manipulated, how subtle the control had been, how I hadn't even realized I was trapped until I had left. The fear of relapse, of letting her back in, was constant, and the thrill of independence, of finally being unshackled, was just as intense. I began documenting everything, the manipulations, the emotions, the victories, the doubts, in a journal. Not for anyone else, not for revenge, not for proof, but to anchor myself. To remind myself that I had survived, that I had chosen myself, and that no one could take that away without my consent. By the end of the 4th week, I understood something vital. Leaving wasn't just an act of escape. It was an act of self-preservation, yes, but also an act of courage. And the courage didn't stop when she stopped texting or calling. It didn't stop when social media tried to trick me into doubt. It continued in every choice I made for myself, every boundary I held, every night I slept knowing I hadn't compromised my dignity. And slowly, I began to feel something I hadn't in years. Anticipation. Not anxiety, not fear, but anticipation of a life rebuilt, piece by piece, outside the shadows of someone else's expectations. For the first time, I was starting to see the horizon, not just as a place far away, but as a space I could walk into freely, with no one dictating the path I'd be by the 5th week, I had started to notice something subtle but profound. I was no longer reacting. Not to her messages, not to the accidental encounters, not to the social media posts carefully designed to provoke me. I had stopped measuring my worth through her eyes, and that, more than anything, felt revolutionary. It wasn't that I didn't think about her. I did, more than I wanted to. Memories snuck up on me when I was alone. Snippets of laughter, moments of tenderness, arguments replayed in my mind with all their painful intensity. And at first, I felt the old familiar pull, that ghostly gravity of attachment, the part of me trained to seek her approval. But slowly, I realized the difference. I wasn't missing her. I wasn't longing for her. I was mourning the version of myself I had lost while I was with her. That version that laughed freely, slept without anxiety, made decisions without second-guessing. That version had been buried under months, years, even, of manipulation disguised as love. And now I was digging it up, one careful step at a time. One evening, I went back to the small notebook where I had been documenting everything. The fights, the manipulations, the moments of doubt, the victories, the revelations. I read through pages I had written in tears, in anger, in relief. And I realized something. The story wasn't just about leaving her. It was about finding myself, piece by piece, in a world that had always been waiting for me to reclaim it. That night, I took a long walk. The city streets were quiet, the kind of quiet that lets you hear your own thoughts. I passed the cafe where we had met that day, and she wasn't there. I felt a flicker of something I hadn't expected. Peace. Real peace. Not the fleeting, fragile kind you feel when a fight ends, but deep, anchored calm. I realized I could exist in the world without her presence dictating the temperature of my life. The next day, I ran into a mutual friend who hesitated before greeting me. I could see the questions unsaid, the curiosity about whether I had given in or moved on. I smiled, casually, because the truth was that I had moved on. Not because I had found someone else, not because I was looking for replacement happiness, but because I had finally discovered that I didn't need her to define my joy. I had found it myself. And yet, she kept trying. Subtle messages, people passing along what she was saying, hints dropped like invisible threads meant to pull me back. But I didn't reach for them. I didn't check. I didn't falter. It was as if the more she tried, the more I solidified the invisible walls around my autonomy. I realized something profound. Boundaries aren't just lines you draw to protect yourself. They're declarations of your existence, visible to anyone who cares to see. One Saturday morning, I went to the park. The sky was gray, clouds hanging low, but the air was crisp and clean. I sat on a bench with my notebook and began writing again, this time not about her, not about us, but about me, my hopes, my mistakes, my plans. I wrote about things I wanted to do, places I wanted to see, skills I wanted to learn. And for the first time, the words flowed without hesitation, without fear of judgment, without shadowing anyone else's expectations. Freedom, I realized, isn't a destination. It's a series of choices, small but deliberate, repeated over and over until they become your life. And my freedom wasn't about her absence. It was about my presence. My presence in my own story, in my own life, unfiltered, unapologetic, undeniable. That evening, I stopped by a bookstore I had always wanted to explore. I wandered through the aisles, ran my fingers over spines, picked up a few books I'd never have dared touch before. I lingered in the poetry section, letting verses wash over me, feeling something I hadn't felt in a long time. The quiet thrill of choosing joy because it mattered to me, not because it pleased someone else. And as I left the store, I felt a strange sense of finality. Not closure in the traditional sense. She would never call it closure, and frankly, she might never understand it. But a personal closure, the kind that comes when you reclaim your life and stop giving someone else the power to define your worth. I walked down the street, the city humming softly around me. My phone buzzed once, a message from her. I looked at it, felt the familiar flicker in my chest, and then did something I hadn't done before. I deleted it without reading. Just like that. No hesitation, no second thoughts. I had chosen my peace, and nothing she could say would take it from me. Later that night, I sat at my desk, listening to soft music, writing in my journal. I wrote about the weeks that had passed, the emotional storms I had weathered, the moments of doubt, the victories both small and large. And I realized something. I wasn't just surviving. I was living. Fully, completely, without apology. The texts, the calls, the subtle manipulations, it didn't matter anymore. They were echoes, remnants of a past I had left behind. And in their absence, I found presence. The presence of my own mind, my own body, my own choices. The presence of someone who could finally exist without fear, without manipulation, without compromise. By the time the night ended, I had made a quiet promise to myself. No matter what came next, no matter what shadows of the past tried to reach me, I would stay here. In my life, in my choices, in my freedom. And with that, I finally understood something essential. She had never been the prize. I never needed her approval. And leaving her wasn't losing anything. It was gaining everything. Because the person I had spent so long trying to be for her, the one I had hidden under layers of fear and doubt, was finally free. And that freedom was mine, unshakable, undeniable, and worth everything I had lost along the way. For the first time, I felt it truly, the quiet, extraordinary, unstoppable joy of living for myself.